All right, so I'm going to talk about my field of study. This is a subfield within second language acquisition. Well, we don't think of it as a subfield. We think of it as the real second language acquisition, but okay. This is the so-called generative second language acquisition. So the scholarly field of second language acquisition aims to explain the process through which people who already speak their mother tongue learn a second, a third, and additional languages. And second language acquisition focuses mainly on adult learners, people who start learning the additional language after puberty, after the so-called critical period, which I will say something about a little later. So related but separate fields of inquiry are bilingualism, child second language acquisition, third language acquisition that is becoming very popular these days, heritage language acquisition, instructed second and foreign language learning and teaching, but they ask slightly different research questions. So for the last 40, 50 years, second language acquisition has aimed to reveal and describe different facets of the second language acquisition process. Now, a strength of the field is the variety of perspectives from which the process is examined. So it is well established that second language acquisition is embedded in a linguistic environment. It happens in a social context. It depends on the culture of the societal group. Its path, rate, and accuracy may depend on the person's motivation, surroundings, learning strategies. However, in spite of their individual circumstances, personal experience, native grammars, second language learners end up with a version of the second language grammar. So the important research question related to language cognition is, how does knowledge of the additional language come to be in the speaker's mind so that they can understand and produce the phrases, sentences, and discourse of the new language? A central insight that generative second language acquisition advances is that while learning a second language certainly depends on exposure to and usage of that language, universal language acquisition processes also lend a significant hand. Because the SLA research endeavor is interdisciplinary, we can say that generative approach to second language acquisition constitutes a substantial addition to the wide-ranging picture that the rest of SLA paints. Generative second language acquisition is a specific approach that focuses on the cognitive investigation of learning an additional language, which means that it predominantly focuses on grammar rather than sociolinguistic issues. Now, some basic concepts that are essential to the field. So generative second language acquisition assumes a definition that views language from a cognitive and generative perspective. It's a system of signs and the rules governing how those signs combine. A grammar that generates all the acceptable sentences in a language while excluding unacceptable ones. And the linguistic sign is a mapping of form and meaning. Knowledge of this system of signs lives in the human mind as a network of linguistic representations. Why is it called generative? So linguists who embrace and study this view of language are co-generative linguists. The term generative stems from the idea that sentences are generated rather than reproduced from some repository of ready-made sentences in the brain. Every time we convey a message, we start dressing our thoughts in language by putting the words together in ways we may have never heard before, checking their grammatical shapes and then their order. Now, at the core of the generative approach to language and language acquisition is the concept of universal grammar, the common blueprint of all languages, or the genetically determined aspect of the human capacity for grammatical knowledge. Over the years, this concept has undergone considerable theoretical reconsideration, by the way, and now the latest version of it from Chomsky 2005, there are three equally important components in it. The first one, generative views of language acquisition are currently guided by Chomsky's 2005 three factors that determine the nature of language as an internally represented grammatical system. The first one is genetic endowment. Then we have experience, or PLD, primary linguistic data. And finally, there are principles not specific to the language faculty. So, and those are the three factors that Chomsky considers essential in the process of language acquisition in general, and that have been taken up by generative second language acquisition. So the first factor is the species-specific universal grammar. This is the grammatical knowledge by which all languages are constrained and which is used in first and subsequent second language acquisition. Importantly, universal grammar has been substantially reduced in size and complexity in current versions of generative linguistic theory, minimalism. So, and one should not imagine universal grammar as a localized neurological structure somewhere in the brain, or a device or a tool. Instead, it's an abstraction for the species-specific language knowledge. The second factor is exposure to the linguistic input. Learners arrive at form-meaning connections that are essential in language learning by mapping signs to extralinguistic situations. And the third factor refers to general biological, physical, and computational laws of two types. First, principles of data analysis that are used in language acquisition, but might be also part of other domains of cognition. And second, architectural constraints that facilitate efficient computation. And that's normally represented in the minimalist binary model. So, universal grammar. A few words about this significant concept of universal grammar. As in child acquisition, second language knowledge relies on the same three essential sources of information that I just mentioned. So, the first source of information about the L2 is still universal grammar, the common blueprint of all languages. So this blueprint includes information such as all languages have nouns, verbs, prepositions, well, or postpositions, adjectives and adverbs that express lexical meanings and combine derivational and functional information. All languages have grammatical features that could be overtly or covertly represented, such as plural, case marking, definiteness, genericity, and many others, actually. Then whether these are expressed overtly or configured on lexical items or not is language specific. Sentence meaning is compositionally read off word meanings, taking their order into account. Discourse and context effects can change sentential meaning as well. Now, from the birth of generative linguistics in the 1950s, generative linguists have expressed the notion of universal grammar via the logical problem of language acquisition that comes from Chomsky, actually. So, and the rationale goes like this. Language is complicated, but children appear to acquire their first language relatively fast and without much trial and error. So they must be doing this with some help from innate capacities. There must be aspects of language knowledge that children do not need to discover for themselves, because those aspects constitute part of our human biological endowment. And this argument was naturally extended to second language acquisition by researchers such as Lydia White, who is pretty much considered the founder of the field of generative second language acquisition. Lydia White from McGill University in Canada. Pretty much all big names in the field from the very beginning are her students, considered, including my academic advisor. Right. Then now there is an important difference between L1 and L2 acquisition, the L1 and the L2 acquisition processes. Second and subsequent language learners have already acquired one or more languages. The native language appears to be a critical source of information, at least in the beginning. So second language acquisition researchers have convincingly shown that the native language provides the first hypothesis of how the new language works. So generative scholars such as Bonnie Schwartz and Rex Prowse, 1996, Lydia White, 89, expressed this idea in the following way. The initial state of second language acquisition is the final state of first language acquisition. So now, in other words, we approach the second language assuming that every property in it might work in the same way it does in our native language. And only when we have evidence to the contrary, provided by exposure to the second language, we do adjust the L1 assumption to something approximating the L2 property. What is there to learn in a second language? So when generative second language acquisition came into being in the 1980s, the answer was formulated in terms very similar to those of the principles and parameters framework by the 1981, by Chomsky in 1981. So principles constitute the universal information common to all languages that does not need to be learned and comes for free from universal grammar. Parameters are options. Very often they are described as binary switches within universal grammar that define language-specific variations. Like a very famous one, pretty much the first one that was investigated thoroughly in generative second language acquisition, was the null subject parameter. And some other word order parameters So the null subject parameter, which divide languages into those who can omit the overt representation of pronoun versus those that cannot. So English is not a null subject language. Thai is a null subject language. An intriguing idea popular at the time was the parameter cluster. At the very beginning, a lot of research was dedicated to this extremely fascinating parameter clustering idea. So a very famous one is Snyder's compounding parameter. So that parameter unifies several constructions in a cluster. And this sounded very appealing at that time, and there was significant evidence pointing to the credibility of that clustering, although later on, people who started working within parameter clustering encountered some serious problems. So, like in the compounding parameter, languages that have noun-noun compounds, like English, like you can say car park or Toy Story or a student center, and Thai allows that as well, actually. So languages that have noun-noun compounds were believed to also have verb particle constructions, like they drank all the juice up. You can separate the verb and the particle. Then double object constructions, like to give somebody something or to buy somebody something. Then resultative predicates, such as to wipe something clean or to pound something flat. And make causatives, like to make somebody do something. I believe Thai also has a make causative. So Thai probably follows into the majority of properties are displayed by the Thai language as well as they are in English. So why were these constructions hypothesized to be in a parametric cluster? Well, because they occur together in languages around the world. So languages that do not allow root or noun compounds productively, such as Spanish, for example, they don't have the rest of the constructions either. And Snyder made the following acquisition prediction. He said that a child learning English would either acquire compounding first or acquire compounding and verb particles at the same time. But typically, so in no case would a child acquire verb particles before compounding. So there is first of all, those properties are clustered, and the knowledge of one of them presupposes knowledge of the others, but also there is a certain order, or there is one property that is acquired first. And once it's acquired, there's this big explosion and everything else gets acquired as well. So, of course, this was extremely tempting and fascinating to do research on. There are different clusters that were identified. And, you know, the predictions were tested in longitudinal studies on English learning children, and those predictions were very, very strongly supported by the data at that time. So this is one of the early types of research that the field was engaged in. Then during the time that the principles and parameters view of grammar was dominant in linguistic theory and in second language acquisition, the main research question was whether second language learners have access to universal grammar, because we know there is universal grammar in first language acquisition, but is it accessible in second language acquisition or post-puberty or after the so-called critical period? So researchers attempted to answer this question by investigating properties that had different parametric values in the first and the second language. So the logic was as follows. If researchers could find evidence that the second language parameter was acquired, although it's different from the first language, from the setting in the first language, this was considered support for the notion that learners had access to universal grammar. So this conclusion followed because the languages in question had different parametric values, such that knowledge of the L1 parameter would not help acquisition of the L2 parameter because transfer cannot occur. So a pioneering study in this area was carried by a linguist from City University of New York. She's still there, actually, Gita Martoharjono. She's American Indonesian, so a lot of her studies involve Indonesian. So she tested learners' knowledge of long-distance English WH questions. I'm not going to go over that, but because this is a complex thing. But generally, there is this WH movement parameter where, let's say, English and Thai behave differently with respect to that. Because in English, the WH question moves to the CP area, while in Thai it stays in situ. And I hear that every single day in the language of my daughter, whose native language is Thai, and Papa, we're going where? Papa, you're eating what? And she's almost 6 and she keeps talking like that, which means WH movement has not taken place in English. And I hear that every day, pretty much. So I'm not even trying to correct her to see if she can figure it out. So yeah, this is one of the first parameters that was studied by Gita Martoharjono. Then another example was the Kano, who studied pronouns in Japanese and the so-called overt pronoun constraint. Overt pronoun constraint has to do with the interpretation of the reference, that overt pronouns carry, because in English you cannot have covert pronouns, like the sentence such as who did you say bought a car? So I think he combined WH movement with overt pronouns. And sometimes in Japanese, whether you have an overt pronoun or not, the reference could be different, because one interpretation will be, who did you say bought a car for himself, versus who did you say bought a car? Like somebody said that somebody else bought a car. But anyway, I'm not going to go into detail. This is very valid in Italian as well. But English does not allow covert pronouns. But in languages that allow that, overt versus covert pronouns may have a pragmatic function, and they may refer to a specific referent, which could be ambiguous in English. So yeah, the Japanese was one of those languages that was studied very thoroughly with respect to that. So in the 2000s, the prominence of, and this is actually the time that I remember, that's when I encountered this field, generative second language acquisition, and principles and parameters gave way to the grammatical features that came with Donna Lardier's feature reassembly hypothesis. Donna Lardier, Georgetown University, still there. One of the biggest field names in our field. So, and of course, this was informed by minimalism, and again, the Chomskyan generative and minimalistic theoretical framework. So there were formal features such as case, person, gender, number, which were considered the building blocks of grammatical representations. Semantic features such as definiteness, specificity, uniqueness, past, perfective were also proposed to be represented in functional categories. And all these features in various combinations were expressed on lexical items, such as verbs and nouns, and they were reflected in functional categories. The feature reassembly hypothesis emphasized that acquisition of the functional morphology of language involves much more than acquiring binary parametric values. So assembling the particular second language lexical items requires that learners configure features from the way those are represented in the first language, because it is I'll just point to two very interesting cases where feature reassembly differs, like plural marking in Korean is given as an example, and specificity restrictions. Like in Korean, apparently, I don't know Korean, but there is a famous study on Korean. Plural marking is kind of optional, and you can mark plural only if you have a specific noun. Not like in English. In English, you can say, okay, let's say I'm thinking of an English analogy. Like in English, if you say, I want the apples, there are some specific apples, so you're going to use plural. But if you say, I like apples, non-specifically, you still put plural, a plural form. But in Korean, it will be something like, I want the apples versus I like apple. So if your noun phrase is non-specific, plural doesn't get marked. And you see, that's a different feature reassembly, because you have an integration of specificity and plurality. Those are semantic features, and they mix in a different way. The English past simple and past progressive, and the Spanish preterite and imperfect are another example, because in English, past simple is used for a single event and a habitual event. You can say, I went to school yesterday. But you can say, I went to school every day last week. And you use went, the same form, for single and habitual. But if you say, I was going to school, that's going to be an ongoing event. That's a different, there's a different feature there. But in Spanish, it's the opposite. You have one form to mean single event. And the one that means habitual and ongoing uses the same form. So that's why Spanish speakers would often make the mistake of, last week I was going to school every day. And at that time I was going to school. So they use the what is the English progressive form, they assign the habituality meaning to it, similar to Spanish, because again, you have the forms, but the features that are encoded on those forms are different. And then reanalysis or reassembly, as they call it, as Lardier called it, should be done. Then a major tenet of generative second language acquisition is the existence of universal grammar as I said earlier, as part of the biologically endowed human language faculty. So the postulation of universal grammar is also the main distinction between generative second language and other cognitive branches of second language acquisition that are known as usage-based approaches. So usage-based approaches embrace several linguistic, several different positions, like those are Bybee, Rod Ellis, Tomasello. So they claim that linguistic representations, both in L1 and L2, are created without any help from innate capacities. The input is sufficient to model all language knowledge. The human brain can be compared to a powerful computer which observes the regularities in the language a speaker is exposed to and generalizes over these regularities. So, well, generative second language also assumes the process through which most linguistic mental representations are created is dependent on abundant exposure. But there are certain properties that allow us glimpses into the functioning of universal grammar. And for generative scholars, the cases that suggest an operation of an innate language acquisition device and make all the difference are those described as poverty of the stimulus situation. So there was a lot of research on poverty of the stimulus situations where the linguistic exposure and the amount of input you get does not explain, because it's insufficient, poor, fragmented, it does not explain eventually the competence that is acquired in the second language. And, there is a famous study by Schwartz and Sprouse where they describe 5 different types of poverty of the stimulus properties. And this is one of the biggest arguments in favor of universal grammar, that there are those properties that the input is sufficient and they can be explained only through access to universal grammar or the existence of universal grammar.
Ivan, can you hear me?
Yeah.
I'm just getting a bit concerned about the time. It's almost...
Are we? Okay, because I thought we started a little later and we'll continue about... Yeah. Let me just do 3 more minutes and...
Okay.
Yeah. So, I just want to go over very briefly about the main areas of research. And there are 3, or rather 4 areas of research. L1 influence, that's the transfer possibilities, and how does L1 transfer take place, and access to universal grammar. Then acquisition of functional morphology and feature reassembly, and probably the latest one, and the one that I have been mostly involved in the last 10 years, is interfaces, linguistic interfaces, where more than one of those linguistic domains is involved. They could be internal, such as morphology, syntax, or syntax semantics, or external, and the most interesting ones, where the discourse is involved. Just 1 more minute about experimental methods. And this is an interesting thing, actually, because generative second language acquisition, experimental methods have historically involved offline measures, like tasks placing no time pressure on the participants. These methods include grammaticality, acceptability judgment tasks, truth value judgment tasks. This is because generative researchers have argued that if designed appropriately, these tasks can tap into second language learners' underlying linguistic representations. Offline methods are no longer a staple of the field, although I still do only offline methods, pretty much, due to the lack of access to technology for the others. So an increasing number of researchers now use online methods such as self-paced reading, eye tracking, event-related potentials to measure the real-time processing of various linguistic structures. And of course, we can attribute this increase to the fact that online methods have become more accessible in terms of cost and ease of use. And another reason is that researchers have shown a renewed interest in understanding how second language learners can compute linguistic representations during real-time processing. And this is pretty much it from me. And now, Ben. Thank you. If you have any questions, I don't think we have any time. I think we should probably listen to Ben's talk first and then see about questions.
Okay. I mean, I guess there should be a brief Q&A if people have any questions, or maybe they can type into the chat box or something. And maybe, let's see how much time we have left at the end. Let me see if I can share. Thank you, Ivan, anyway, for your...
Sorry about this, but we started later, so you started 15 minutes late.
Second language acquisition, very interesting. We don't appear to have any moderator, so I guess we're moderating ourselves. So I'll do my talk, which is kind of quite compact, to be honest. Are you seeing my screen? I seem to be sharing it.
Yeah.
Okay. Hang on a sec. Is it big or is it small?
It's good. It's perfectly visible on my screen.
Okay, just a sec. It's like on my screen, it's small.
Yeah, it shows a little small, but it's okay.
So I think you're not seeing the right. Oh, there we go. So what are you seeing the big screen now? Or I'm not sharing anything.
Oh, I don't see it.
There we go. That should work.
Yeah.
Are you
seeing it's good now. Screen? It's bigger.
Bigger. Okay, good. Yeah. That's because I'm working on like a double screen thing. Okay, so good morning, everyone. Almost afternoon. Today, I'm going to introduce an area of linguistics.
Ben.
Huh?
If you could increase your volume a little bit.
Okay.
Are we good?
I might have to move to the microphone. Can you hear me now?
I think you're fine. Yes. Thank you.
The microphone's slightly at the side, so I'll sit slightly ajar then.
All right, okay. I think it's fine. Yes, thank you.
Okay, so I want to introduce briefly a field of study called psycholinguistics, an area of linguistics. And this subject kind of continues somewhat from how Ajahn Ivan finished off, in a sense, as it studies how the human mind processes language. For today's talk, I'm going to focus on a sort of small segment of that, notably how we recognize words, understand sentences, and interpret meaning in real time. So in this talk, I want to look briefly at how psycholinguists investigate these processes using experimental methods, but just a real brief overview. So right now, I guess everybody here is listening to me in English, speaking real time. And for most of you, if not all of you, perhaps English is not your first language. Yet, I'm kind of assuming that you can mostly follow what I'm saying almost immediately. Even when we pause or reinterpret something, comprehension still moves forward, nevertheless. And in psycholinguistics, we're normally talking about first language, native language processing, actually, rather than L2, which I'll come on to later, which is kind of a separate applied area of it. So even when comprehension is effortful, it still happens very quickly regarding native language processing. And these processes largely happen outside of conscious awareness. Comprehension is nevertheless quite complex, and we do attempt to study this in real time as it happens in real time. So psycholinguistics studies how the brain processes, hang on, oop, the screen's gone off. How the brain processes language in real time, combining linguistics, psychology, and cognitive science. Oh, what's going on here? I've got to zoom up. Sorry. I don't seem to have one. Ah, there we go. Okay, so to understand this, we can look briefly at the stages involved in language comprehension. First, the acoustic signal presumably reaches the ear. The brain must then segment that into that continuous signal into words. And as each word is recognized, several things happen very quickly. The meaning of the word is activated, and we know this experimentally. It starts to become integrated into the structure of the sentence. The overall structure then, as it becomes integrated into the sentence structure, meaning then becomes accessed as the brain starts to construct an interpretation in a sort of step-by-step manner. But the key idea here is that the process of comprehension is incremental. The brain doesn't actually wait until it gets to the end of a sentence before interpreting it. Instead, meaning is built step by step as each word arrives into the system. All of this happens really quickly, of course, often within milliseconds or fractions of a second, very quickly in real time. I think most people here will have heard of the concept of the mental lexicon. So I'm going to talk in this section briefly about word processing. And the mental lexicon is essentially the mental store, the hypothetical mental store, if you like, of words and their meanings. But the mental lexicon is not organized like a dictionary with entries listed in alphabetical order. Instead, research tells us that words are organized in structured networks of related concepts, primarily based on meaning, but somewhat based on sound as well. So as you see here, this node shows doctor, and this is kind of this visual is kind of one way in which researchers visualize how words are connected together in memory. But alternatively, you might think about word representations in more linguistic terms. So you might have a central word, doctor, for example, and it's connected to other words through meaning, such as nurse, patient, and hospital. So psycholinguistic, we know this because psycholinguistic experiments show us that these connections can influence how quickly words are recognized when we read them and how quickly they are processed, often within mere milliseconds. The brain works incredibly fast. So in other words, recognizing one word or hearing one word can make it easier to access words that are related in meaning. This network organization becomes especially important when we look at how activation spreads between related concepts in the network, and we can measure this experimentally. So building on this network idea, I just sort of briefly mentioned, researchers propose, or one way of thinking about this is through the concept of spreading activation. So when one word becomes active, related concepts or meanings that are connected to that word also receive partial activation, but the activation isn't infinite. Word activation goes back to resting levels quite quickly, but for a brief period of time, many related words are activated in the mental lexicon, in the hypothetical mental lexicon. So for example, in this visual, if you hear or see the word doctor, this would be the primarily activated word, and related words would also become activated around it, such as nurse, medicine, patient, hospital, and so on. This activation spreads automatically throughout the network, and unrelated words such as door and car and table, as shown here, would not receive any activation because they don't have any semantic or any direct semantic connection to the word that was heard or seen, right? So the key, okay, so this is a kind of theory. The key question becomes, how can we observe this activation experimentally? So the classic kind of way of tapping into this is using a semantic priming experiment based on the lexical decision task. So for word processing, word recognition research, lexical decision is a commonly used task to determine how knowledge is organized in the mental lexicon. So in this task, it's quite simple. Participants would see a string of letters on the screen and then press a button to indicate whether the word is a real word or not. So the real words are mixed in with what we call pseudo words, which are kind of made up words that look like real words and sound like real words typically, but don't have any meaning. So in this, as I've laid it out here, doctor is actually presented before nurse. Nurse is the target word, which is responded to, and doctor is the prime. And in one condition, there's clearly a close relationship between these two words, and you get a faster response when nurse is presented. It's accepted faster compared to a condition where there's no relationship or a indirect relationship potentially between the two words, the prime and the target. So in the second condition, the prime is flower and the target is also nurse, and you find a slower response compared to the related condition. Now, so the key finding is that semantically related pairs are recognized faster by around about 100 milliseconds or so, which seems quite small, but for the brain, that is enough to reveal how words are organized in memory, or how words are represented in the brain. So the first word we call the prime, so doctor and flower would be the prime, and this partially activates the second word in the mental lexicon, and you can detect this if the target is presented quite close together with the prime, but if there's a bigger gap, then that activation fades very quickly, right? So let's have a look at a quick example of this using a sort of demonstration online, right? So a quick demonstration. I'm going to say the word a word, and I'd like you to just think about what you connect with that particular word when I say it. So let's have the word bread. Somebody's at the door. This is a great time to arrive. I should have had doorbell, huh? Most people would probably think of, at least English speakers would probably think of the word butter, or as a strong word, strongly connected word to bread. That may not necessarily happen in Thailand because bread is not a stable, but you know, in the Thai context, other words could be used, and you would find that certain words connected more strongly to other words. Whereas if we paired it with chair, as in the example here, if we compare these two pairs, which pair do you think would be processed faster in a reaction time experiment? Bread and butter or bread and chair?
The first one.
The first one, yeah. Bread and butter. I guess it could be bread and jam. That might be a
Yeah. Bread and jam. I was thinking for Thailand, that's going to be more relevant.
Yeah, or bread and toast potentially as well.
Yeah.
Toast might be another strongly connected word. The idea isn't that there's one particular answer. It's just that your brain, your individual brain, of course, will generate the most likely response for you. And normally we look at this on the average, right? So this is the semantic priming effect kind of in action. And the evidence tells us two important things. The mental lexicon is largely organized by meaning rather than alphabetically. I was going to show a video at this point which actually shows that lexical knowledge is widely distributed across the brain, but there wasn't really time to fit it in. But that's something I do show in the, and words are kind of connected together in cohorts of meaning, which is very interesting when you look at the sort of neuroscientific evidence. So the mental lexicon is organized primarily by meaning, not as a dictionary in alphabetical order, which people initially thought it was. And lexical activation spreads through networks of meaning within milliseconds. So this is kind of the key takeaway here, really. I've just made a quick reference to some recent work from our group that has examined semantic priming across many languages, including Thai. This is the first phase of this has been published in Nature Human Behavior, and the second phase will be finished. I think 19 languages have been published, and then it'll be up to 30 odd languages from a sort of global study, if anyone is interested. That was published last year. So far, I've looked here at how individual words are recognized, but language comprehension also requires us to understand how words combine into sentences. In other words, understanding language is not only about recognizing words, it also involves building structure, which I briefly alluded to in the beginning, and then interpreting how those words relate to one another. So if activation spreads across related words at the lexical level, not at the subjective experience level, we can now extend the question: what happens when those words are combined into sentences in real time? So to recap, we've seen how individual words activate networks of meaning in the mental lexicon. So when you focus on isolated word processing, but of course language is not isolated words, although I would say that the isolated word processing is my core area of interest in the field, but not only. So words on their own do not produce sentence meaning. The brain must be able to build structure, and meaning is built rather by combining words into a structured representation. And in psycholinguistic terms, this is word processing is happening at the same time as the structure is being built, right? But obviously the structure building is taking over. So you might, visually I might depict it sort of like this. As each word arrives, the brain builds syntactic structure and integrates each word into the developing interpretation, the word structure, meaning. And this is how overall utterance meaning or sentence meaning does unfold. And in psycholinguistics, we refer to this as sentence parsing, I guess. In linguistics, it's referred to as parsing. So sentence parsing refers to the process by which the brain, or the mind, if you like, constructs syntactic structure and interprets a sentence as it unfolds. I tend to use the brain because a lot of this happens below our conscious awareness, or below our kind of subjective experience of what's going on. So it's kind of like the cognitive processing underlying the ability to understand or comprehend meaning from sentences. I'm going to give you an example now. It's just a basic example. And what I'd like you to do, I saw someone in the chat, is to read the sentence silently to yourself. And then I'll ask you a question about the sentence. So let's have a look at a basic sentence that Ajahn Ivan will probably think it's not a good example, but in terms of psycholinguistic measurements, which I'll come on to, I mean, psycholinguistic experimental methods, I'll briefly mention afterwards. So just read it silently to yourself. So who interpreted the deer as the object of hunted? Because that would certainly be one reading. And that is typically a reading that many readers will engage in. And we know this because
Yeah. I did that, you know, before
you did, yeah.
At the deer point. After that, I immediately went back.
Yeah, when you hit ran, right?
Yeah.
That's when it changes. But we can measure this in real time, and I'll sort of go on to that. And you kind of alluded to some of this briefly at the end of your talk as well. So the deer is usually initially interpreted as the object of hunted. So this suggests that structure is being built as we read through the sentence. When you get to the word ran, this signals that the deer is the subject of that part of the sentence. So reanalysis is required, and this may involve backtracking in real time to begin reading the sentence again to build another structure. So the revised pass would be, while the man hunted, a natural pause, the deer ran into the woods. So that would be a correct pass of the sentence to get the meaning. So this phenomenon we refer to as the garden path effect, because we're following it to a particular destination, but we realize quite quickly with sentences like this that we're getting to a slightly incorrect interpretation. So it tells us that experimentally, it tells us that the brain commits to interpretations very early rather than waiting until the end of the sentence before constructing meaning, right? So sentence processing is incremental, happening in real time, comprehension is being built. And we can observe this moment of revision experimentally. And one way this is done is through measuring readers' eye movements while they read. So this is the kind of takeaway sentence. I'll go on to the experimental evidence next. So sentence meaning is constructed incrementally. That's the take-home point. And the brain commits to interpretations early and revises them when necessary, typically while reading. This is done with eye tracking, but also with self-paced reading studies, which is kind of a poor man's eye tracker. I noted a recent publication here from our group that investigated similar questions about sentence structure using self-paced reading paradigm, as published recently in Learn in January. And this study examined how speakers of Thai and English process relative clauses in real time. So there's some, I'm not going to go into that, but there was some partially interesting results about Thai, but it generally followed English by and large. So eye tracking machinery is used to measure what people's eyes do during reading and to observe these moments of processing difficulty experimentally. So researchers measure reading times generally, whether they use eye tracking or self-paced reading. And reading times could be individual words, or it could be on specific regions of interest, depending on how the study is set up. And eye tracking allows you to watch or record or measure what people's eyes do when they read sentences. And the technical term is called regressions. So when you read, sometimes you will backtrack or regress to start reading a chunk of language, sometimes from the beginning over again. So in garden path sentences, so sentences that create slight ambiguity, eye tracking studies show us that readers slow down at the disambiguating word. In our example, previously it was the word ran, of course. So when readers read kind of normally up until that point and then they slow down, they're in speed, they will slow down at that particular region because they need to reassess or reanalyze the building of the sentence structure in order to construct meaning. In eye tracking terms, you see backward eye movement. So people's eyes go backwards and reassess. So these patterns and linguists obviously are able to set up various language structures that allow us to test where certain patterns reveal where processing difficulty occurs. So these methods allow researchers to observe sentence comprehension as it unfolds in real time. And it's usually done visually with reading because it's a bit harder. I mean, there are other paradigms to look at spoken language, but I'm not talking about that here. Let's look at the next concept, which is prediction. So I'm going to show you a sentence. And what I'd like you to do is to complete that sentence with the first word that comes to mind. I don't know if I can open the... that's it. I'll open the chat box and see if I can display this at the same time. Oh, okay. Let me get back to the meeting group chat. So I'll show you a sentence, and all I'd like you to do is just to type in the first word you think of. Don't take long about this, just do it kind of as quickly as you can. Quick. Also see how many people are actively listening as well. Okay, we've got 2 answers. That's enough.
Yeah.
I don't want to spend too long on this because I can't really see how we're doing for time. Probably over. So yeah, most people, you would expect most people to say kite here immediately, but there are other possibilities, of course, I guess drone, flag, balloon, and so on. And the brain will generate these other possibilities, but the idea is that the brain doesn't wait simply for each word to appear when listening to or reading a sentence. Instead, it actively anticipates what is likely to come next. So comprehension is also predictive. So based on context and world knowledge, the brain generates expectations before the next word even appears. And this prediction is not random guessing. The brain doesn't consider every possible word in the lexicon. Instead, it quickly narrows down a small cohort or a small set of highly probable candidates. And through the mechanism of lexical selection and so on, the response would come there. So in technical terms, we call this competition, and that's resolved very quickly, allowing comprehension to proceed extremely rapidly. I don't know how we're doing for time. I don't have I'm just going to finish then. A few more slides to finish anyway. I'll try another example just as a brief demonstration. So a slightly more complex sentence. I'll show it on screen. And if you could just type quickly the first word that comes to mind in the chat box. Oh, not as fast this time. Oh, good. Okay, I think we can work with that. A couple of answers. So as you can see here, we didn't get the same answer, and obviously some sentences are going to produce the same answer, and some are going to produce different answers in the individual, and that's perfectly fine. But notice you did okay in real time. When you're doing this in real time, you would respond a bit faster, but your mind didn't consider every possible word in the language. It considered the context here. By reading the sentence quickly helped you to narrow the range of likely candidates that you can use. And of course, we don't experience this in our mind, but our brain is experiencing this. So this process is, do we have any of those? False? Yeah, a few different possibilities there as well. So psycholinguistic research shows us that the brain continuously generates and updates these expectations during comprehension. And this kind of research can also be tested using semantic priming as well, using the sentence to prime the response. And again, we see in classic studies that both meanings or multiple meanings can be activated and so on. Well, this is more of a generative kind of answer generation kind of task. So far we focus on sentence processing in native speakers. I keep moving away from the mic, sorry. Most people, especially in Thailand, of course, use more than one language, as well as around the world, really. And an important question this raises is, do second language speakers process sentences in the same predictive way as native speakers? So psycholinguistic research can also investigate prediction in how it operates in second language comprehension. So second language usage also raises an important question in psycholinguistics. So we might consider this an extension of, rather than mainstream psycholinguistics. So does prediction operate in the same way when we process word sentences and so on in second language? And research shows us that prediction does occur in second language processing, but it's often weaker or slower than in native language comprehension. And some possible reasons for this are that experience with the statistical patterns of the second language may be somewhat reduced for a second language user, depending on their background, of course. And another possibility is that second language comprehension often involves greater processing demands, which leaves fewer cognitive resources available for prediction comprehension as well at the same time. However, this is not a particular problem in psycholinguistics because the variation across bilingual speakers can provide a valuable opportunity for research. I'm using bilingualism here in the sort of loose sense, or I suppose it should be multilingualism, where you can look at differences in experience, proficiency, and exposure to the language to test theories about prediction and language learning. Some recent work, just mentioned briefly on the slide here, has examined similar questions in the first one in a large-scale study comparing many L1, L2 readers from different L1 backgrounds, published in Language Learning, again from our group, including the Thai study. And I also published this myself, the focus on the Thai sample. So focused more sort of local context, focused on second language reading and Thai learners of English, in case anybody's interested in those. So to sort of finish off, let's return to the question we began with. How does the brain process language in real time? It's language comprehension in your native language feels largely effortless, but it does involve multiple rapid processes, notably lexical activation, sentence parsing, or structure building, prediction, and sometimes rapid revision when our interpretation turns out to be wrong. And all of this occurs within mere milliseconds. Sometimes the differences are very small, but they can be detected using properly designed experimental procedures. So ultimately, psycholinguistic methods allow researchers to measure these processes experimentally. And I think this is one reason why psycholinguistics is such an exciting field to study. So I think even though, just to sort of quickly finish off, even though language often feels effortless, it is complex, but psycholinguistics can show us how complex and also how remarkable the architecture is for processing language. Today, I focused on a sort of small part here deliberately, real-time language processing, but psycholinguistics as a field covers a much broader range of topics, including word recognition, sentence comprehension, language production, language acquisition, bilingualism, as well as the relationship between brain and language, or the neural basis of language. So broadly speaking, the field aims to understand how language works in the human mind. So I'm happy if I don't know if we have time, but I could take some questions. Just need to get back to my beginning part. So that's the end of my talk. If anyone has any questions, feel free to ask or to drop it in the chat or to ask another time, potentially.
Ben, can I ask you a question? Because I'm not very familiar. I mean, I know a little bit about those things, but in addition to semantic priming, there is also phonological priming, right?
Yes.
Okay. Which one is faster?
It's a good question. Probably have to test it. I mean, semantic priming is in I didn't mention it here, but in the neural signature, so in event-related potential methodology where you measure the brain response, semantic priming happens around about 400 milliseconds after stimulus onset. So it's pretty quick. The classic study that I didn't mention here shows that it was by Swinney. You're probably familiar with it, in 1979. And it's an example sentence where the meaning of bug could be spy, or it could be like an insect. And immediate priming shows that both meanings become activated, but only if the lexical decision task is instantly after hearing the word bug. When you put a gap between the two, that semantic effect or semantic priming effect disappears, and only the dominant meaning becomes activated. So my feeling about this, without being able to answer directly, is that semantic processing is dominant, of course, in sentence processing. Phonologically, normally it would be done, I mean, it can be done in a phonological priming experiment, but typically it would be using a visual array where you have some objects on the screen, and one word is connected phonologically to another, like beaker and beetle, right? They sound similar. And then you have distractor words like, I don't know, some unrelated words by sound, and the connection between the two is phonological. And the instruction is put the beaker in the, what's the instruction? Put the beaker in the cup or something like that. And you find that when in eye tracking, you find that people's eyes look at both beetle and cup. So both processes happen very quickly, but it may depend on the kind of context, I think, as to what.
Because, sometimes I catch myself when I try to talk fast, I just misspeak. And let's say if I have to say, well, I mean, I cannot, I should probably write down every time it happens. Like instead of nurse, I may say purse.
Yeah, but this is speech production stuff, which I didn't talk about here, and errors happen in speech production, and they
Yeah,
can
but
be both
yeah, but
semantic
isn't this
and
because of the
phonological.
clustering? Isn't this because of the
No,
phonological?
in speech production models, the phonological assembly is late in the process. So I didn't talk about speech production here at all. I only talked about comprehension. So
Yeah,
it's
yeah.
kind of coming in rather than coming out. So in speech production, phonology is last. And normally in comprehension, it's written language, but there are some studies that focus on spoken language too. Written language is a bit easier to deal with, I think, for comprehension, but spoken language, yeah, the classic findings are from Fromkin and Garrett and people like that, linguists who came up with production theories, which are a little bit limited, I think, but they explain the data. But experimentally, you know, Levelt is the main person who's developed you know, speech production is lemma access initially, which is meaning and syntax, word level access, not sentence first, not grammar first, then structure building, then phonology, then articulation, right? That's the basic speech production model proposed by Levelt, and this has been tested experimentally. So in that case, for speaking, phonology would come last. These are separate levels of linguistic representation, yeah. But I mean, experimentally, you would, if you wanted to know which comes first, you would need to design an experiment to test. Because I think it depends on how it's set up rather than per se, right? The goal of comprehension is to get to meaning. And if it's coming via spoken language, then phonology is going to be first, right? But typically, comprehension experiments are written language, a lot of them. Yeah, I think we've gone well over. So yeah, when I did that myself, it was much faster. Oh, well. Okay, we didn't get any questions. I don't know if anyone's still here, or if it's just me and you, but obviously we can talk more about this later. As I think there's some overlap with your. It was kind of nice that you hinted at online methods towards the end of your talk.
Yeah,
there.
I've never done those,
you
you know, because it's more demanding. You need technology. It's more expensive.
It is, yeah. Eye tracking is a challenge because we don't really have that machinery, but you can kind of mimic it using self-paced reading, you know, where you kind of show part of the sentence step by step. And creating experiments using software is much easier now. You know, when I did it in the old days, I had to program in Visual Basic, and now we have software to do this. It's quite straightforward. Unless you want to do anything really complicated, and then it's a bit more challenging, but it's definitely doable, yeah. Computer-based stuff. Okay. I don't know if anyone's here or hosting or it's kind of I don't know if I kept moving away from the mic or not, but hopefully
No, it's fine. It's fine now.
You can hear me all right, yeah. I'm kind of right in front of the mic. So
well, I guess that's it.
yeah, thank you.